Today in Masters of the Air Talks, we've brought back a guest who joined us during one of our Military Movie Club episodes when we compared Memphis Belle with Masters of the Air. In this episode, we get to talk to Scott Grange again and learn about the book that he wrote, titled Flying Lessons, inspired by his grandfather, who was a B-24 Liberator pilot. My co-host, John W. Peace, is also an author of a book inspired by his grandfather, titled A Boy from Cracker's Neck. So today we have the opportunity to hear two authors have a conversation about their grandfathers, their books, and the important stories that have influenced our world.
Well, Scott, glad to have you on again. I've mentioned this before, was one of the things I really enjoyed with Masters of the Air, not only the miniseries, but also reading that book and in turn reading your book, Flying Lessons, is, it went into the storylines and the histories of the resistance in occupied territories. And I've been a World War II history buff, but there was probably two aspects that I really hadn't studied a lot about and really not even given much thought about. One was the resistance movement, and then second, the POW. We all grew up with Hogan's Heroes, but we know that was strictly comedy. In fact, one of my characters and one of the true life gentlemen I grew up with, he was a POW, and he would mention how Hogan's Hero made his life real tough because everybody just thought, he went through what was Hogan's Hero and stuff. But so it gets to my first question is, were the characters in your wonderful book, were they based on real people? Were they based on real events? Give me what you were doing when you were creating your book, writing.
Okay, fair enough. It actually is a story. It's about 30 years old, to tell you the truth. When I had declared a history major and education major in college 30 plus years ago, my grandfather hadn't told me a lick about his experience. I knew he had been a World War II B-24 pilot. I knew that he was in the Pacific, actually, but he just didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about it to my mother or my aunts or my uncle, and he certainly wasn't talking to it about it with me. And so when I declared education and history as an education major, and then my last couple of classes in doing student teaching, he actually sat me down and started talking to me about it, and just small things at first, just small things about, the plane or his training or, being in the Bay Area and moving from an AT-6 trainer to the Liberator, and just small things like that. Not even really about flying in the war itself, but more, his camaraderie with his friends and whatever. And then my first year that I started teaching, he sat me down, it was at Thanksgiving, I believe, and told me a story about one of his flights. And it was shocking. It was gory. It was nothing I'd ever heard from him before. And when he was done, I remember asking him, Grandpa, why now? Why are you telling me now? And he goes,
I'll ask you that question.
Yeah. And he goes, well, you're a teacher now, and I want you to pass some of this stuff on your kids. So 30 plus years ago, I kind of got I wanted to write a story to honor my grandfather. And at the same time, I knew that my dad's dad had never been accepted into the Army. He had tried 3 different times, and of backstories of, hey, I tried to get in and all my brothers were doing it and all my friends were doing it and they wouldn't let me in, and they found reasons to keep him home, and they were all solid reason, at the time. The last one was, hey, you're the last breadwinner left in your family and you can't go. You have to stay. So I had these kind of stories in my head, and then, life happened. And I became a teacher, and I taught for 30 years, and I had kids, and I traveled, and I did all this other stuff. And, and you have to also realize that I grew up on for World War II were, from Leon Urie, Jack Higgins, and they're all about the action and the espionage and, John Le Carre and had some of the spying stuff, but not a lot of it was about the resistance, as you said. So it's really only the last couple of years, I think, that a lot of those types of books were coming out. And so your question has 2 parts. One was, are they like based on real people? And the answer is yes and no. The hero, yes, was based on my grandfather, Franklin, as a B-24 pilot. And some of the stories he told me about as I was getting through my education and listening to him, some of those made their way to the horrors of flying, the boredom of not flying and waiting for that time to go up into the sky and playing baseball against B-17s and just some of that kind of stuff that actually, the series Masters of the Air actually portrayed very well. So, because there was time, but in their mind, I don't think there ever was a downtime. There's always, when's the next flight coming? When's the next thing coming? And so,
the anxiety, I couldn't imagine. Yeah.
And knowing, and then the anxiety of when the flights came back and you're missing a couple planes or some friends that never returned and not knowing if they were POWs or just didn't make it at all. And those of my story were definitely from stories from my grandfather. And so I based the general characters on their patriotism and wanting to be there, but also that anxiety and fear that they all felt also. You get these schoolyard history books that tell the kids that everyone was so brave and everyone was wanting to go to war and they were, but they were scared to death too, in reality. And so those realistic feelings I put into the characters because I think it's one of the ways that we do honor them, that they were human, that they really did believe in the not coming back or not being able to see someone again or not being able to return stateside to see their family or their loved ones or their fiancés or whomever it might be. So that part of the characters, yes, that's all real. The actual characters themselves were kind of just a conglomeration of all of that and then the stories that I had in my head. And then the second part of your question about the French Resistance was, again, just kind of more recently of a lot of the books that have been coming. We have the John Le Carre, we have this gentleman right here, Alan First, who wrote several, about 20 years ago, kind of started the new wave of, hey, there's this whole new story that people weren't talking about, but we're sacrificing just as much, if not more, than some of those pilots.
I tell you, and let me tell you this quick conversation Melanie and I just had not too long ago. Our grandfathers were risking their lives, yes. But think about the resistance. They weren't only risking their own lives, they were risking their whole families. I mean, if they got caught, their whole family would be wiped off the face of the earth. I mean, can you that's a whole different ball game. I mean, risking your own life's one thing, but risking every friend, family that you know of.
Yeah.
I mean, that's even a more, couldn't imagine that type of pressure.
And bravery too. I even there's a scene in the book where, the pilot that has been downed is in northern France and he's kind of going about his business and whatever. And the people that are helping him, the resistance, are like, you don't understand. If you get captured, by Geneva Convention, you should be a POW and, they'll keep you alive. If we get captured, that's it. If it's a girl, she could go through horrors that no man could possibly imagine and then probably killed. If it's a man, like you said, the whole family could be wiped out. You could lose everything. Your house could be burned, your business taken from you. I mean, things you've worked all of your life. Whereas a POW, you have a chance to survive and you're behind, German lines. And a lot of that happened to our pilots and to our the paratroopers. But if you were part of the resistance, whether you were in Normandy or Norway or Belgium or any other of the occupied areas, you were risking everything. And like you said, beyond everything, because there was other people that were going to be involved.
There's one scene in Masters of the Air, the miniseries, where the resistance kills what they suspect is a German spy. And they kill them real quick. And when we did some of the live talks we did, there was a lot of people going, oh, that was too quick. That wasn't enough information to just kill the man. But when you think about what they're risking, everything. If they suspect you were a spy, they had to react. So
and that was a great scene in that series, because even as a viewer, you thought the guy was American. He sounded like it, and they're walking him by, and they do what they need to do, and the Americans were shocked. He's like, I was just talking to him. He's an American. What are you doing? And I think that is some level of fear and anxiety and seriousness that you and we can't understand. Thank goodness.
Yeah, and those American airmen didn't even realize what kind of danger they were in. I mean, they knew it, but they didn't really know it.
It's true. They were oblivious of it, and it's shocking because it is so fast, and it comes at you in that scene. But when you come back and you think about it, and as you watch a little bit more of that series, you come to understand that paranoia, and honestly, the knowledge that they had gained for doing it for so many years up to that point. It starts to make sense of why that scene happened as quickly and as abruptly as it did.
One thing in your book I want to bring up that I really did appreciate was not only talking about the resistance, it wasn't just the Germans they had to be afraid of. It was maybe potentially neighbors. Remember, you had the neighbor in there, and they were like, he's asking too many questions, and then of course you had informants, and of course the Germans were very good at turning people and also putting pressure on them, blackmail and threatening their family. So.
Yeah, no, and that's true. And that's why I wanted to put that in there. Again, it's something I've learned maybe in the last 5 to 10 years or so, of all the little annoyances and everything that was going on. So the Germans knew that there was a French resistance. No one can, you can't ignore that. They absolutely knew that there was a resistance. And so, they infiltrated that as well, and not with their own people, but with the French or with the Norwegians or whatever country you were in. And so, you weren't just worried about trying to find a German spy in your midst, in your neighborhood or walking down your street. It was your neighbor, and maybe they'd been promised security, or maybe they'd been promised goods, or maybe they'd been promised protection, or with the women, a lot of the stories that had come out of Normandy especially were women that they were protecting their children, and I hate to say it, but they would sleep with German soldiers for that protection. Or the farmers, they were told that they would serve at the end of the war, they would get rewards and they would be able to keep their land. And I think the Nazis at that time were very good about manipulating what they wanted in the future, and so they passed that along to especially to the people in Normandy, where this is what we're promising you. We're going to win this war. And when you're in the middle of that war and you're occupied by Germans, I don't think you could see any other outcome. You wanted a different outcome, but your reality was you're occupied by Nazi Germany. And if it stayed that way, a lot of people did it for their own self-preservation, and maybe their families too.
Yeah. Well, you told a wonderful story about that Scott. And, got me more interested into a new aspect of World War II history that I had just never really delved into. And like I told you earlier, Masters of the Air, the one aspect was the POW aspect. I had just never really, we knew, and I've read the numbers of how many, 70,000 POW airmen and all that, but it's hard to comprehend exactly what a large number, and also how long. The true life gentleman that was a POW that I knew here in Big Stone Gap, Virginia. I mean, he was a POW for over 3 years. Oh. He was captured in North Africa, even before Normandy and stuff. So, and like he told my granddad, told myself, in the early years when things were going well with Germany, he said, I got to admit, probably wasn't the worst situation, but as things went downhill for Germany, things went down for the American, or all POWs in particular. The rations of food, no health care. So hard to imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And then one thing I did learn, actually, as I was writing the book, as I was kind of looking at podcasts and looking at stuff online and some new printed material, is that they're actually within the French resistance in Normandy. There was a little bit of a clash. You had two groups in Normandy. One, the French Normans that had been there for a while, but you also had the French communists. And they wanted to do things a little differently than some of their French comrades. They felt that the atrocities that were happening on the Eastern Front with, communist Russia and the German troops and what had been going on, and the news they were receiving from the Eastern Front about how the Germans were treating them, and how the battles of Stalingrad and the horrible, the scorched earth policy, everything was going on in the East. They, as a group, maybe not individually, but as a group, the communists that were French resistance wanted to go about things a little bit differently. They wanted to be more violent. They, in general, were more violent. They were the ones that were derailing trains and murdering people, in their Nazi soldiers in their sleep, one by one by one.
Inglorious Bastard stuff in the movie.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so that was also going on too. And so there was a little conflict between these two groups of resistance players, even as the war was going on, where you have one that's saying, look, our job is to gather information and pass that along. And the other one's like, no, look, we are here to avenge our comrades in the East. And sometimes those clashes didn't turn out well. And I was able to kind of incorporate that into the book as well. And because, again, that was something that was new and fascinating to me. I mean, I taught history at that point for almost 30 years and studied it and read so many books, and fiction and nonfiction. Fascinated. In the resistance, they were conflicted about how best to arrange and carry things out, and both did their own. And even to D-Day and past, they were still conflict in those groups of how to best do and carry out felt their mission was.
Wow. Well, you did a wonderful job telling that story, and
thank you,
bringing that to life for me and stuff. I wanted to ask you this question about, your main character is based on your granddad, Franklin. Looking back and see, in my book, my granddad did not say a word about, he was so talented at diverting questions when you ask about his war stories. Now, and my granddad loved telling stories. He would tell history stories of growing up. He would tell stories about our location, different things. But when you got down to asking about war stories, I mean, he was just great at diverting. Oh, I didn't do that much, and all that. And one thing that I really did learn, and he was such a tough, but he's a very stoic guy. But after I've had time to reflect, after writing the book stuff, I realized he was really suffering from probably a lot of PTSD.
Oh, yeah.
And he handled it the way that generation handled it. And I was just wondering about your own grandfathers, what you looking back, what you felt that,
just last week, my aunt called me up. My mother's sister. My mother passed away a couple of years ago. My mother's sister finished the book and called me up and said, Dad, my grandfather, Dad never talked about this to us. He would sit down with three silly little girls and convey all this stuff that he experienced. And I think that's it. I think that even PTSD comes in several different forms, and you and I can't relate to that. But yeah, I truly believe that my father and so many of that generation had, whether they wanted to admit it or not, but in one form or another, that's when they didn't talk about it. And one of my purposes of writing this book was to help our generation, and hopefully younger generations than us, understand that this is leaving us, and the stories aren't being told. But even those stories that are told, it's done with such a memory of 80 years ago or whatever that they may not even be accurate. But not choosing not to tell them, that's a form of trauma also. One of the reasons for this book, and one of the reasons why some of the violence in the book, it's not all that violent, but some of the violence in the book, like Masters of the Air, was maybe to help us understand that, holy cow, what they saw, what they experienced, no human should ever see. No human should ever experience that. And so living through what they did and then coming back home and having to raise a family and be a normal American and buy a house and get a job and live forever. How do you explain that to us? You can't. And so go ahead.
Oh, one thing I've talked to Melanie about, and I'd love to discuss this idea with you more. Okay, now I'm an economics major from school, and took master's class in it and stuff. And talk about the greatest nation, greatest generation. Those men came back, and so many became self-employed. Now you had two things going on. The GI Bill, which was the first time in the history of the world you had a large working class people going to college. First time in the history of the world. And then second, like my granddad, one reason he became self-employed, bought this farm that we live on now and stuff. He said, son, it was hard for me to go through what I did in World War II and sit in a meeting with a boss complaining about widgets and complaining about time cards or y'all not filling out your form. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, getting shot at by Nazis and then sitting through and you got a boss chewing how we've all had bosses chewing your butt about not following. I could see his point, and you saw this huge amount of population that came back from World War II that became self-employed, and a lot of it was because of that. And then, of course, that spurred one of the biggest economies in the history of the world.
Yeah,
as a side effect.
It definitely was a side effect, and I don't know if that's something that they had planned on, or if it's just because of the type of people in that generation that it was happening to at the moment. I don't, I mean, even being a social historian, I couldn't even tell you which, chicken and the egg kind of a thing. But yeah, so many businesses erupted when those people returned and got that GI Bill, went to school, and then got out. And not just them, their spouses too. It freed up a lot of time and energy for women at that time as well. But yeah, my grandfather came back. He took advantage of the GI Bill. That was how he got their first house down in Manhattan Beach, and that's how he got his first job. And because he was successful at his first job, he actually ended up being a vice president of a junior college because of the experience he did in business. And he wasn't the only one. I mean, his whole flight crew.
Yeah, you get the butterfly effect. I mean, once it gets going on and stuff. And like my granddad said, when he took out and he used the VA loans to help buy our farm along with farm credit. And I asked him about signing that huge note back in, and he said, and there was other gentlemen that said the same thing. And once you've been shot at and stuff, signing a piece of paper, he said, great thing about America is they don't put you in jail for owing money. And, that's such a, but when you think about what they lived through, going from the Great Depression through World War II. I mean, taking that business risk. I have an idea. I'll go borrow money and I'm gonna capitalize on that idea. It's for them. I mean, what that wasn't a risk for them. They risked everything they had, when they were 20 years old.
Yeah. And I think beyond that, what you just said, I think also the mindset was, and I'm gonna make it work on top of all of that. And you're right, it spurred the biggest job generating generation that we've ever seen. And it was wonderful. And I don't think we will ever see that again.
No, not with the percentages of those people.
No.
And then, of course, through the GI Bill, you had an explosion of colleges being born, being created across the country, which has been a great thing for our economy. And job training, community colleges, and you name it. And we really owe it all to that GI Bill. And then, of course, if you go back to the other worst war we had, the Civil War, if you go back to the land grant system, and that was the first time colleges were built for poor people and for working people. First time in the history of the world. They've been universities throughout all the way back to the Greeks, but they were for rich people or religious families. They weren't for the working class, so just kind of amazing, coming from one of the worst experiences of this country, how something is created that helped build us into something better. And everything.
Yeah. And again, it was a chicken and the egg thing. I think, they were doing it because it was kind of the right thing to do and to honor what happened. I'm not sure they realized at the time how exponentially it improved this country.
You know what? I bet money. It was really, what are we going to do with 7 million GIs that can't find jobs?
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, you talk about, I don't think there was that much 3D thinking. I think it was just spur of the moment. of, gosh, we don't have enough jobs for all these GIs. Let's send some of them to school, or let's help them create businesses. It was, what's the thing? Inventions of a result of necessity, and that was
right. Yes.
Yeah. So they created something wonderful, but it was out of necessity. So
yeah, no, great point.
And your granddad was a prime example of that, of higher ed. Well, I wonder if the war had never happened, would he'd ever gone to college? I mean, what do you think?
In his family, no one had gone to college before him. So I would say probably not.
Yeah.
The outcome of that, like you said, the rolling, the butterfly effect, was by the time I came around, my parents, my mom looked at me and it wasn't if I was going to college, it was where.
Yeah, expected. Yeah.
It was expected. And that came from my grandfather, I'm sure, passed down to her, passed down to me. And I remember having the same conversation with all three of my kids. It was not if you were going to go to school, it was, all right, where do you want to go? Because that's where you're going to have to go. So, no, I don't think he would have gone, because he was the first to go in his entire family up to that point.
Yeah. So, yeah, amazing stories like your granddad. Yeah. My granddad, getting back, this on kind of a different subject and stuff. If he was alive today, there was one thing I wish I could ask him some questions about, and I was going to ask you what you would ask your grandfather. One, I'd love to ask them what they kind of heard or knew about the resistance, but now this is one question I did ask my granddad while he was alive. I said, Papa, I called him Papa, what did y'all know about the Holocaust going on? I was just curious. And he said, son, we didn't believe. He said, you'd hear these stories, and he said, you just thought they were war talk, propaganda. He said, he said, it was so impossible for me to imagine a world where people were killing innocent women and children.
Yeah.
He said, now, if you had told me they were lining up innocent men and taking them to camps, I would have believed that, but not women and children. He said, I couldn't imagine. So, in his mind's eye, even when he was stationed in England, they were hearing these stories, and it was just hard for them to believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And with my grandfather being in the Pacific, he was hearing it pretty much tertiary, but there were air crews that were moved to the Pacific after they had served over Europe. And that's kind of where he started getting information. But again, it was tertiary information. It was what they had heard as rumors as they were based in England or later in northern France, and then moved out to the Pacific. And that's how he was hearing them. However, I told you that my dad's dad was never allowed to enlist because of different reasons. And they all had all throughout, the 3 years, there's always a reason he couldn't go. A couple of his brothers went. One of them came home in a bag. But one of his brothers was actually the lead force that liberated Dachau concentration camp. And the stories he came back with. And it wasn't just that first step into the camp with the smell of death.
Yeah.
But greeting and working with the prisoners. And then he said almost more harrowing was talking to the German citizens of the town of Dachau itself. Because, again, I think it's hard for us to believe that they didn't know what was going on. It was shielded from a lot of Germans as well. What actually was happening. Did they know there were prisoners there? Of course. Did they know that there was dying there? Yes, they couldn't hide that. But to the degree and all of the experiments and the numbers of people that were dying and how they were treated, that, at least in Dachau and several other places, was well hidden from the German citizens. Because, again, we have to understand that there was a difference between Nazis and Germans, even during the war. And but his stories of going in and liberating Dachau after the war, now he was one that freely talked about stuff.
Really?
My great uncle on my dad's side freely talked about the liberation and the ground wars and everything. And he absolutely didn't hold back. And there are a lot of details I had that I was able to pass along to my students from his stories. So maybe that was his form of dealing with it, is getting it out every chance he got to, unlike my grandfather on the other side.
Yeah, I had one true life character, Carlisle Clark, who had cut the gates open and freed a concentration camp, and kind of the sad story with him. You know, he would not talk about it, and late in life, before he died, he just started having tremendous nightmares, PTSD of the camps and stuff, and always my granddad's. You know, it just made us feel real sad because that man really suffered from what he experienced. You know, when he was 20 years old. And hard to reconcile. You know, yeah, really, really was.
Yeah.
Scott, I got some more questions for you, but I got to tell you this one personal story. Gentleman that used to come by the farm, very dear to me. We called him Coach, but his name was Burchell Stout. He was in the invasion of Normandy. And I got to give you a little bit of his backstory so his comments won't seem so outrageous. But now he grew up about as dirt poor on a mountain apple orchard here in the coal fields as you can do, starving to death. 6'4", skinny as a rail, living off rotten apples. Okay, because they had to sell the good ones for the money.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Never had a pair of shoes all the way through high school. You know, he'd have sacks he'd wrap up in his feet and went. So that's his backstory. Okay. Goes off to college, finally gets food, becomes this hulk of a man. Then World War II starts. He volunteers. Invasion of Normandy, fought all the way to the Rhine River. Okay, when Saving Private Ryan came out, I ran into his wife, who was at the grocery store, and I said, Miss Stallard, I said, have y'all seen the movie? Oh, yeah. Went and saw it opening night. And I said, well, I want to stop by and talk to Coach about it because I knew he, you know, had been through it all. And I got there and I asked him about the movie. And, you know, I was a little bit worried. You had these reports of World War II veterans having PTSD flashbacks and stuff. And I said, well, Coach, what'd you think about it? And Scott, he looked me in the eye, no bravado, no ego. Now, this ain't a man bragging. He was just looking at me and said, son, that opening scene was as real as you could make it. Absolutely. That's the way it was, son. And I said, well, you know, has it bothered you? He just gave a big, deep breath. He said, son, he said, the only thing I can tell you is the day after I'm in a foxhole with plenty to eat and brand new boots on my feet. He said, if it wasn't for the shooting and the killing, it wouldn't have been half bad. And, you know,
wow.
You know, these kids will hear that, oh, that man's bragging, that man, but you have to learn, you have to really know how hard he grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was several other World War II veterans having new boots. Even my granddad couldn't get over having new boots now, and he did not grow up poor and hungry. But just when they entered the war, and we did a video on Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was talking about he had never had it so good as World War II, having 3 meals a day and new boots.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just want to tell you, Coach, I mean, wonderful character. Now that man, like I say, he would have killed every Nazi. They eventually sent him home.
I think once again, I mean, we can talk about it, we can read about it, we can hear stories about it. I just think that what these men and women in their own positions went through is a perspective that we could never understand, that we could never comprehend, truly comprehend. We think we can read about it. We can see things like Private Ryan. We can watch Masters of the Air and, you know, have great actors portray those emotions and those horrors and the, you know, the camaraderie versus the carnage. But I still don't think that we can really get what that was, what it was really.
And also how they were preconditioned during the Great Depression. Your grandfather, how did he grow up? Was he poor, hungry, or how was his personal situation?
No, not like that. They were lower class, but not for wanting. No, but you know, there was it was one of those where you had, you know, 8 kids in 2 bedrooms kind of a thing, but it wasn't starving. It wasn't hungry. It was Southern California, you know, and so both parents worked. Mom, I'm trying to remember what my great grandmother did. Well, one of them, Standard Oil. I'm sorry. His dad worked for Standard Oil. So
he had a job. Okay. If he had a job during the Great Depression, you were doing pretty good. if you had a paying job.
Yeah. And so that's what I said. It wasn't for wanting maybe the physical conditions, everyone didn't have a bedroom or anything, but no, they didn't starve. They were certainly not like what you just mentioned. But yeah, I think there were still lessons to be learned with 8 kids in a 2-bedroom home, a couple miles from the beach, where you've still got people that didn't have to work, were living that kind of life, and you could see it every day in Southern California. And that was definitely not my grandparents.
Yeah. I think your granddad grew up a lot like my granddad. He would classify himself as poor, but not hungry. He said, we had everything we really needed.
Yeah.
We just didn't have money. There was no money out there and everything. And he was talking about, he was probably a teenager before he actually saw cash money. Everything was a barter system here in the mountains. Barter, but they lived on a small farm. My great grandmother was an excellent farmer. She kind of ran the farm, and my great granddaddy had a cash paying job in the mines. So they kind of were poor, but had stuff. And had stuff to trade, and that was the most important thing back then, was trading. But anyway, I gotta get you this question before I forget. Scott, you have experienced something that I'm very jealous of, because it's on my bucket list to do. Is I want, before I die, I want to tour some of the World War II sites in England and in Europe, and I'd like for you to at least hit your highlights and what would be your. If you were telling me to go, where would you tell me to go first, and then maybe prioritize and say next, and then if you get to go back here, yeah, segue into that.
Fair enough. I was very lucky. When I was in high school 30 plus years ago, my parents ended up meeting an incredible gentleman, and they started tour groups out of the high school in Carson City, Nevada. And I was lucky enough that it was my parents that did it, so I got to go multiple times. And met an incredible gentleman. He is from Germany, has stories of his own, where he was born in what is now, or what we think of as East Berlin. When his parents knew the wall was going to be built, they shipped him off to West Germany, and they stayed behind, and it's a whole different story. But he's the one who did the tours, has a really incredible outlook, not just of post-war Germany, but just because he speaks 9 different languages and is so immersed in the continent that he just knows so much. So several of the things that I learned and taught in my history classes and then put into the book also were from him, from his perspective, from a very worldly European perspective. And anyway, I was lucky enough to go in high school, and then, the Gulf War happened. I was in college, the tours stopped. Like I said before, life kind of happened and I moved on. And but when my adult life started slowing down and I was looking toward retirement, I started thinking, God, I'd love to get back to Europe again. I wonder if Bert still does tours. And so thank God for the internet. I was able to find him, knowing where he lived and knowing his first and last name, and lo and behold, this gentleman 30 years later was still doing tours. Wow. So long story short, we got it together. And instead of knowing him as a, 18, 19, 20-year-old years ago, I now got to know him as a 48, 49, 50-year-old. In fact, I had my 50th birthday with him in Paris, which was on Bastille Day, because that's my birthday. So it was an amazing experience. But one of the things, and it's almost exactly like you said, is one of the things he goes, okay, well, you have a group of students. You're coming back after almost 28 years of not being here. Where do you want to go? And the very first thing, I swear, John, I said was, I want to go back to Normandy.
Okay.
I want to experience those beaches, those museums, and that whole thing as an adult now, and not a teenager or someone in his young college career. I've lived 30 more years now. I want to experience it now with adult emotions. And both my grandparents had died by then, and I was kind of doing it a little bit for that, I suppose, maybe emotionally. So he goes, all right, well, I know probably what you're going to say, but what would be number one on your list? And without hesitation, it was the cemetery, the U.S. cemetery sitting above Omaha Beach. Okay. Because I had these visions in my head, these memories in my head as a teenager, going to that cemetery. And now that I knew so much more and I'd lived, so much longer and everything, I wanted to go back there and see that again. So our first year we went back, which I guess was 7 or 8 years now, we went to Normandy, and that would be the first thing that I would tell you to do is you make sure you get to that U.S. cemetery that sits right above Omaha Beach. And
I'm gonna tell you a little secret. The scene at the end of Saving Private Ryan when they're in the graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, as an adult, that's the first time I remember really tearing up in a movie. And I could imagine being there, like here in this picture.
Yeah. And it is amazing. You walk in there and you see pictures like this or you read about it or whatever. But when you walk into that cemetery, that hollowed ground, and there are hundreds of other people there, and there are busloads of kids and tour groups, and it's this quiet. Wow. It really, you don't have kids taking selfies and hugging grave markers for being silly. I mean, everyone understands when you're there what it means, because you just, this picture right here behind me, you can see a little bit of it. There are approximately 9,400 crosses and Stars of David in just that one graveyard. And those are just U.S. soldiers just for Omaha Beach for one day. Wow. And it is mind-numbing to look at that, that beautiful green grass. And in that picture, we were lucky, that this particular day was just a gorgeous day with that blue sky. But those gleaming white marble crosses just go on and on and on. And they make these really interesting geometric shapes, as you can kind of see behind me there. It doesn't matter which way or which angle you look. It just goes seemingly forever. And it is a remarkable place to visit. And I put it as the character in my book, yes. But they were my experiences walking through that graveyard. And one of the most heartfelt memories that I have of going back just a couple of years ago. In fact, it was the 75th. So it was 5 years ago, 75th anniversary of D-Day. I happened to be there the last time I was there.
Quick question on cemeteries. Yes. You being in history, you might know. Now, I know for a fact they couldn't build that at the time. Did they have a temporary? And then when did they actually start construction? I'm just curious because they had to wait till after the war, I'm sure. And
they did. I don't know the exact dates. I know it was in the 50s that the French government and the American government got together. But yes, those bodies were buried or entombed other places, and they were kind of scattered about, not just above Normandy. They did an awful lot of research. There was an awful lot of coordination between the governments. And when you go there, there's a French flag flying in the cemetery as well. Obviously, it's on French soil. But it was a coordination between the governments. And I don't want to start spouting out dates because I really don't remember off the top of my head.
Oh, you've given me enough.
The idea started in the 50s, probably with Eisenhower as president, but I can't be sure about that.
That makes sense.
But yeah, it really is an amazing place. And I do remember, and like I said, I put it in the book as a character's experience, but it was my own, where there was one time I was, my kids, my tour group, they were out in the cemetery, and I let them have about 2 hours to kind of wander around the grounds and get the feeling and take pictures and whatever. And it sits above a bluff above the beach, the actual beach, which is a public beach. And if you weren't in tune to the language and you just looked down at the beach, it looks like it could belong in Southern California. It's a big, wide, sandy beach.
Oh, beautiful.
And, there were people down there playing music and playing soccer and drinking and having a good time and swimming in the ocean. Yeah. And I remember two things, and I put them both in my novel. One was sitting on the wall, and in Saving Private Ryan at the very beginning, when he's walking along the pathway, the very, very beginning, there's a rock wall. So if those of you that are watching this and you just pull up that Private Ryan scene right at the very beginning, he walks along and you can see the beach down to the left side. The cemetery is off to the right. I've sat on that wall. Wow. And I remember thinking that with these 9,000 plus crosses over here, that those families down there wouldn't be speaking French, may not be playing soccer. That beach might not be open to the public at all.
Yeah.
That was one thought I had. The other one that I had is, like I said, as my tour group was out and about in the grounds on their own time, I was seeing there's a rotunda kind of in the middle of the grounds, and I was sitting on the steps, and I heard this conversation, and it was in halting English and then in good English. And I looked over, and there were several very elderly men, one on a cane, all in white hair, if they had any hair at all. A couple of them had, U.S. hats on, U.S. such and such.
Yeah.
And then there was a gentleman there in a beret. And then another pretty well-dressed gentleman, but he was speaking in English in a very heavy German accent. So you had a former Nazi soldier, you had a former, French soldier, and a couple of American soldiers. And I don't know what they were saying to each other. I wasn't close enough to hear what they were saying. But as I watched them, God, I'm getting goosebumps right now. As I watched them, they got closer and closer, and finally, all of them hugged each other, and they're bawling, just bawling. And so here you are, 75 years after this cataclysmic event, this one day on this one beach, and you have former enemies there, and they're hugging each other in the middle of all these crosses. And John, I did cry. I'm man enough to admit I started bawling too. And it was an amazing emotional scene to see these gentlemen 75 years later reconcile and deal with it. And maybe, I don't know if those Americans, maybe that was the first time they'd been back to that ground, maybe
I'm sure probably was. I mean,
yeah. And so I put that in the book because it was so emotional and everything. So those pictures that Melanie put up there, those are a couple of years ago, 5 years ago. Above the beaches and some of the coastal towns that are out there. This particular one's in Arromanches, which is just east of the D-Day beach of Omaha. And this is actually where after we secured the beaches, this was one of the areas we were able to do temporary harbors and floating pylons and get all of our equipment onto the ground and into the battles. So this is Arromanches. But dotted throughout that entire countryside, John, are buildings and monuments and museums everywhere. You have huge museums, like there's one in Arromanches that is very, very famous. But there are really small ones in these little towns dotted all over Normandy, where maybe they've got an artifact that they dug up or was left over, and so the town has that in part of its little museum. This one here, obviously this is a D-Day one because it's got artifacts and uniforms and unexploded bombs and tanks and stuff inside this museum, and what it looked like that day. And these museums are spread out all over Normandy. And honestly, you can't go wrong. It doesn't matter if it's in a little town of 200 people and they've got a little building that looks like a house. It's worthwhile to go in, up to these big ones that are pretty famous that have a lot of military stuff in them. So yeah, to answer your original question, Normandy, hands down, definitely go to the cemetery. But there's one thing I do want to tell you real quick before we move on, is that cemetery isn't the only one that's there.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to go to one that really makes you think, go to the German cemetery. That's also above the beaches of Normandy. So I told you there's 9,400 crosses, more or less, of American soldiers. The German cemetery has over 22,000 bodies in it.
Wow.
It is remarkable. And so it's not one of those things that you would see on a tourist list or one of those things. You can go to the old batteries they've left behind, or the cemeteries or the museums. But going to that German cemetery is also an experience in and of itself. I
wanted to share the one story, and it was in my book, and it's a true story, talking about seeing the three veterans. I wrote a chapter of post-war, probably in the 50s, when where my granddad was working at the milk processing plant. They brought in that German engineer to work on the equipment, and he was a former Luftwaffe pilot. Ooh. And my granddad would talk about that all the time, sitting at a local restaurant in Big Stone Gap, having a beer and a hamburger. And he said, son, and he always preached it, he said, love your country, but he said, never trust your government. He said he was always a distrustful government person. And he said, because here was a man that was sitting with me in the booth who had grew up on a little farm like I did, suffered the way I did on the Great Depression. And 10 years earlier, we could have been shooting at each other because two governments told us to.
Right. Yeah.
And,
yep.
and you know, just remarkable, you know.
Yeah.
And my granddad would always tell that story. He said, you know, just he's a country boy just like me. And
yeah. Well, I've got two things real quick we can close off with.
Yeah.
One, to kind of add on to that, I told you my grandfather that flew was in the Pacific. My aunt ended up marrying a full-blooded Japanese gentleman.
Really?
My uncle.
Okay. Yeah.
And I remember I got the courage, and his parents were actually interned at Manzanar. Again, another story, another day. But his parents were actually U.S. citizens that were interned at Manzanar. I remember I asked my grandfather one day, I go, hey, Grandpa, when Ron asked you to be able to marry my aunt, Margie, did you hesitate? And he looked at me and goes, no. He goes, and if this is a Japanese thing, let me tell you one thing, Scott. I was there to do a job. They were there to do a job. When the war was over, it was over. And you're right. That was it for him. It was done, and he did it, and they did it, and he did not have any qualms about, and he loved Ron to the day he died. And it didn't matter if he was full-blooded Japanese or not. That was not going to be held against him. So that's one thing. Another thing I'd love to close off with that I hope closes what I've been able to say, plus the travel stuff, plus what you've said. I just want to read a paragraph or two from a section in my book, if that's okay. Is that all right with you?
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
All right. Well, and I know that people that are watching this haven't read this yet. So very small setup. Michael is the main character in 2023. He's the grandson of a World War II pilot, and who we talked about PTSD, who in the book never talked about it. Michael never knew about it until his grandfather dies. Okay. So half the book is about the grandfather's horrific experiences in 1944 surrounding D-Day. The other half of the book is Michael's kind of coming of age and getting that aha about his grandfather in 2022.
To me, it was a wake-up moment. To me, it was a wake-up moment for Michael.
Yeah. And you can just, I hope, throughout the book, you kind of see him go, oh, and then toward the end, you're like, oh, I get it. So what I'm going to read here, just a couple paragraphs, and just set up the scene. Michael is in the German cemetery that I mentioned in Normandy. And the gentleman, Dieter, is the character. The gentleman is the son of one of the Nazi officers that Michael's grandfather meets in the earlier part of the book. Okay, so I just want to read this real quick, and I hope this kind of wraps up what we've been talking about today and gives our audience something a little bit to think about in their future about our veterans and passing things along. So I'll read this. They had reached one of the benches placed around the grounds, and Dieter sat down, gesturing for them to do so as well. He regarded both of them seriously before he spoke again. My friends, I truly believe that what happened here during the war on this soil, on this continent, on this earth, was man's ultimate tragedy. The generation it happened to, your grandparents and my parents' generation, is leaving us quickly. There aren't very many left to tell the stories anymore. There aren't many left to see the signs, to give the warnings, to help us from doing it again. They die by the thousands across the globe every day, and soon they will all be but a whisper. Dieter leaned forward, and both Emily and Michael did so too. I believe it is up to us, the children and grandchildren who knew these people, to keep these stories going, to help keep the memories alive and tell as many people as possible so all this madness doesn't happen again. He pointed to the grave sites in front of him. So these men and the men in all these cemeteries here are worth something more than just a headstone.
Yeah. Amen, Scott.
So, John, as always, I absolutely loved talking to you. You brought up incredible, stories of your own, of your grandfather, your book. I've read it cover to cover, and I love what he was able to give to you, and what you've learned from it, and how you've been able to get that out to us as a public. Your questions today, absolutely love them, and And one of the reasons I wrote the book, and one of the reasons I'm sure you did for you, is exactly what I try to have Dieter say there. These stories aren't done yet. We need to keep these going, and they're important.
You were talking about the headstones of those 18, 20-year-old men. I mean, most of them are 18, 24. Like my grandfather, I grew up with him. My kids remember him, but I realize when I leave this world, his and you think about all them headstones, when our generation leaves this world, there's not going to be really any living people that have a connection with that headstone.
Yeah.
In that cemetery firsthand. So,
yeah,
the only way we can honor them is to, like I say, bring more kids to visit, more kids to read books about it, to keep that alive, because the firsthand memories or when our generation passes, all the firsthand memories of even knowing them are going to be gone. So
yeah, excellent point. And I think that's why what you and Melanie are doing is so important. So thank you for letting me be part of that. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being on. Appreciate it.